Writing Out Loud, a program designed to explore in-depth interviews with writers to hear that words have voices.
Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome to Writing Out Loud. My very special guest today is the legendary journalist Dan Rather. Thank you for being here.
I'm delighted to be here with you.
How well did your Texas upbringing prepare you to be the face and voice of CBS News?
Well, I think it prepared me very well in the sense that I am the son of very hard-working people. They worked extremely hard. They came into adulthood, that is, my parents, during the Great Depression, where jobs were few and far between and you needed to really work hard. That's one thing. Two, I'm a product of public schools. I never attended anything other than a public school. Houston schools 1 through 12, and then I went to a small state teachers college in Huntsville. And I had exceptionally good teachers. I can still remember the names of every elementary school teacher I had and most of my middle school and high school teachers. Very dedicated people who gave me just about all of the education I was capable of absorbing at the time. And also what Texas gave me, and Oklahomans certainly can relate to this, is a sense of place, a very strong sense of place where I belong. I grew up with knowing where I was from and what I was of. And in the Texas of my youth, that was a very strong tie to the land.
You were at CBS for over 40 years. Tell us about the network at its best.
You know, I loved being at CBS. I loved the institution. I loved the history and the lore of the place. I loved the people that I work with. And I always considered myself, and still consider myself, very lucky and mightily blessed to have been at CBS News for 44 years, 24 of those years as the anchor and managing editor of the Evening News.
What's your quick take on Walter Cronkite?
Well, Walter Cronkite was, for me, as he was for many Americans, someone to emulate. That Walter was of that generation of American journalists who had seen World War II up close. And when I came to CBS News in 1962, Walter had been there about 10 years. He was not, quote, one of the Murrow boys, as of the Edward R. Murrow boys. And as a matter of fact, he was considered by them a bit of an outsider, but that's a whole other story. But Walter was a very good reporter, very good journalist, obviously. He also a fierce competitor that, because his on-the-air demeanor was so avuncular, and he created the image of Uncle Walter. I shouldn't say created the image, that's sort of who he was. But nonetheless, one should not have been misled about that. He's a fierce competitor. And at his level, this was long before that I came to the Evening News, his competition for stories, for interviews, for scoops with people such as Barbara Walters, they will tell you in a second what a fierce competitor he was.
What about your 60 Minutes colleagues, Mike Wallace?
Well, I miss Mike. He's now gone. He had a good long run. And not only did he live longer than most people do, that he also was able to practice journalism for a very long time. Mike had not come up in journalism, as you may know. He came up in entertainment. But after the death of his son in the early 1960s, tragic death of a young son who was traveling in Greece, Mike looked at himself and said he wanted to live a more purposeful life. That's when he got into news. So having come into news late, I think one thing to know about Mike is he realized he came into it after he was well into adulthood, and therefore he felt he had to, if anything, work harder, compete more fiercely in order to make up for lost time. Mike was a premier interviewer. I wouldn't say he's as good as you are at interviewing, but he was good at it.
Harry Reasoner.
Well, Harry Reasoner was a gifted writer. Yes, I really don't like the term gifted because it carries with it the connotation that maybe the person didn't work hard to develop that talent. But Harry was among the better writers. Eric Sevareid, the late Eric Sevareid, is by almost acclamation the finest writer produced in electronic journalism. But Harry was in that mold. He was very good with words. I think in another life, Harry Reasoner would have been a novelist, as you are, or some long-form book author. But because he was such a strong writer, that he could be, and sometimes was, a good reporter, but he didn't like to be in the field as much as some reporters like to be in the field. He preferred to be in the studio and sort of view things from afar, a bit like Tolstoy's narrator, and spend time crafting his words.
Who are some of the women journalists that have impressed you most? You mentioned Barbara Walters.
Well, Barbara Walters, who pioneered a lot for women in electronic journalism. Before Barbara Walters, Pauline Frederick, who was a woman correspondent at a time when there were virtually none. But Barbara really cracked through with television, that her ascendancy parallels the ascendancy of television news, that she came into television not as a reporter for the Today Show, just at the time when most Americans were finally getting television sets, and that television was beginning to supplant print, newspapers and magazines, as the source for most Americans' news. But Barbara is a very intelligent person. I think anyone who was around her for even a short time would know. But because she is very intelligent, also because that she is well educated, and she always knew she could hold her own intellectually with anyone else, that she had the kind of confidence it took to be a pioneer woman broadcaster. Diane Sawyer, who now anchors the ABC Evening News and is a friend of mine, came in the generation behind Barbara and had their own difficulties of cracking through. The thing with women in journalism in general, one observation, we now see a fair number of women, I would say a lot of women, on camera, on the air. There are also women breaking through, and they have been for some time, in the behind-the-scenes part of television, but in the leadership roles, in the very top leadership roles of television journalism, it's still the case that very, very few women have been able to break through, I'm sorry to say.
You begin your memoir, rather outspoken, great title by the way, with a chapter on Abu Ghraib. Why Abu Ghraib?
Well, first of all, Abu Ghraib was a big, important story. I haven't broken every big story along the length and breadth of my career, but it was one that our CBS News team, we broke that story on a worldwide basis, not just for television and radio, but in print. It was a horrible story. Nobody wanted it to be true. When we first started, I certainly did not want it to be true. I found myself sort of saying to myself, I'm hoping this story is not true, but it turned out to be true, that there were terrible abuses of prisoners in Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. As things developed, that the CBS News division, which is owned by Viacom, a very large international conglomerate, they were at odds with themselves, if you will, as to whether we should run the story. The corporation took the view, it was clear to me now, wish they hadn't turned up that story. So they delayed running the story for a very long time. Week after week, they just found reasons not to run it. And it wasn't until Cy Hirsch, who was a print reporter and a very good one, got on the story, partly because our sources said, look, we're beginning to think you're never going to run this story, that the network finally ran it. And the reason I dealt with it in the front of the book is because it was the precursor. It was part of what led up to my leaving the network, which is a fairly long story, and I do count in the book. But not long after that is when we got the true story of President Bush's, George W. Bush's, service and lack of service during the Vietnam War. Another controversial story, a story nobody wanted to be true but was true. So these two things are connected. Our expose, our discovery of what happened at Abu Ghraib, the corporate interest, uncomfortable with that. Then when we fairly quickly turned up the George W. Bush story behind that, it was just, look, we have a lot of business we need to do with Washington. We as a corporation need things in Washington. There's legislation we won't pass, there's legislation we won't stop, there are regulations we want eased and so forth. And this is just too costly for us as a corporation. And that's basically the story that I tell in the early part of the book. I always emphasize it. The book has a lot more in it other than that, but frankly, I thought about not writing but then I'd be accused of ducking and dodging it. So I said, look, I'll just put it in the front of the book, get it done, and then go on with other things I want to write and say.
What concerns you most about news coverage today?
Well, I'm going to answer that question, but it's important. You know, I do not accept myself from the criticism I'm giving. That what's happened with news is what I call the corporatization, politicalization, and trivialization of the news. And the corporatization is that we've reached a point that very large corporate entities, by buying off media properties, they're, in terms of true national distribution of news, there are now no more than 6, my count is 4, large corporations that control the true national distribution of news. And these corporations have business they need to do with the powers that be in Washington, whether those powers are Democratic or Republican. So what you have, and I hope you'll forgive the harshness of my language, is very big business is in bed with very big government to serve their mutual interests, not the public's interest in terms of news coverage. So when I say the corporatization and politicalization of news, that is what I'm referring. In terms of trivialization of news, there's been a lowering of the standards. And part of the reason for that is, again, these large corporations, they don't want controversy. They also prefer not to spend the money. So it's much easier to put 4 people in a room and have them shout at one another what their opinions are, rather than have bureaus in far-flung places around the world, or to have investigative reporters digging into things. It's also much easier, and frankly sometimes a much larger audience, if you talk about Paris Hilton or the Kardashians and put that under the heading of news. Don't misunderstand me. There's a place for that. There's always been a place for entertainment news, but not at the expense of issues of war and peace, issues of threats to the environment, what I call serious news. So those are the big 3 when you say what's wrong with news as we know it today. The corporatization, politicalization, and trivialization, the lowering of the standards, I think are very big problems.
Are you optimistic at all that we can change that?
I'm very optimistic. You know, I'm an optimist by nature and by experience, and I am optimistic about most things. You know, not too long ago, and I hope no one will take this as self-serving. You know what I do. I interviewed the Dalai Lama in Dharasama, India, where he's has his redoubt, and he gave me a watch, and on the watch it says, "Be optimistic." And I found myself, after I saw what was on the watch and writing back, thinking, you know, that really might as well read, "Be an American," because I think it's quintessentially American to be optimistic. But whether that's true or not, I'm optimistic. I'm optimistic about the country. I'm optimistic about the future of journalism. We have our problems in journalism, as I've gone through with you. But I think as we get deeper into the internet age, we're now in the internet era, that these problems aren't going to just drop away. But I do think they'll get better. In fact, I see some signs now, perhaps because I'm an optimist and I'm looking for signs, that things are getting at least a little better in journalism. I do think it's not a very good time for the country because we've become so polarized politically at the extremes. But I'm bullish on America. I'm very optimistic about our country.
Tell us what it was like being in the field, Afghanistan, Vietnam.
Well, I love being in the field, and it's when I came to the anchor chair, I wondered, am I going to miss being in the field? I'm bound to miss it. How much am I going to miss it? But fortunately for me, the technology was developing that we could take the evening news to where news was happening. You could do the whole news broadcast from Moscow, or for that matter, from Afghanistan or Iraq, which I did. But what you're looking at here is a reporter who got lucky, very, very lucky, because I was able to live my dream of seeing faraway places with strange sounding names and being on site with things such as war. There's something to be said if you see it as your life's work, wanting to bear witness and to be an honest broker of information, then you always want to be in the field. Sometimes it's not pleasant. War, to say the least, war is savage beyond description, and even beyond television's capacity to convey just how brutal it is. War is real mud, real blood, real screams of the wounded and moans of the dying, savagery beyond most people's imagination. And it's not something you say to yourself, well, gosh, I want to be there just because I want to see something that's awful. But you want to be there, as I say, because you can bear witness and then try to explain, even demonstrate to people some of how truly savage it is. So in that way, but not all field work is covering war or doing something dangerous. It is true that there's been so much war during my lifetime, and revolution and uprisings in the country, that some days, in some ways, danger is my business. But not every field assignment or overseas assignment deals with war or even violence. Frequently you do have natural disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, that kind of thing. But the world's a big place, and there are a lot of big stories out there, and I always wanted to grab a pencil and a notebook and get out of the office to go cover them.
And then devastation on the homeland. All I need to say is 9/11.
Right. Well, 9/11 was unique because we had never been attacked on our own soil in this way, to this extent. Certainly not since the early stages of the Republic, not since the War of 1812 had we been attacked by foreign powers. We had the Civil War on on our own soil. That the Kennedy assassination, which I covered in Dallas in 1963, was there, the assassination, for a short impact period, what we call the 4 dark days in Dallas, was as difficult a story to cover as anything I've covered. In that same line, at that same level, in a different way, 9/11. 9/11 affected, of course, many, many more people. But in terms of being an emotional earthquake, if you want to use another, you being a novelist metaphor, tremendous sledgehammer to the heart. These two stories are somewhat bookended, if you will. The Kennedy assassination in 1963 and 9/11 in 2001.
You were the first reporter to confirm Kennedy's death. How chilling a moment was that for you?
Well, keep in mind I was a much younger correspondent when that happened. It was absolutely chilling for me, and almost heart-stopping. I don't want to overstate it, but I had grown up in a period and among people who believed, yes, we'd had presidents assassinated before. People tend to forget we had 3 presidents actually assassinated, killed before President Kennedy: President Lincoln, President Garfield, President McKinley. But by the time we reached the 1960s, we believed as a people, as a society, presidents aren't assassinated here. Leaders may be assassinated in the Balkans or maybe somewhere in Asia, but this doesn't happen in America. And there was the sudden realization in Dallas that the president had been shot. Even the early indications were that he had been wounded probably seriously and perhaps fatally, but still, when we learned that he was dead, this was well before the official announcement. Understandably, the government wanted to wait a little bit and get itself organized as best it could before it made an official announcement. It was, to say the least, a chilling moment. But I had spent a longer apprenticeship than some covering the police beat. Maybe I spent a longer apprenticeship doing it because I'm a little slower to learn than others. But what we had in Dallas, our CBS News team, it was not I alone. We had a doctor, we had priest, people at the hospital, and then we had a member of the hospital board. All who just said flatly, you know, he's dead. So I said to myself, if I'm working in the police beat in Houston, you have a doctor, priest, head of the hospital board say he's dead. What you've got is a dead man. In this case, it being the president at the moment. But you know, when you're a professional, those chilling moments, those emotional, what for other people would be highly emotional moments, don't last very long, because you discipline yourself. You say, I have to put those feelings aside. I have to put them deep down within myself and stay laser beam focused, zoned on the story. For the journalist, one can like it or dislike it, and from the outside, it's sometimes hard to understand. The story is what counts. And realizing that the president not only was seriously wounded, but was actually dead, you say to yourself, I may never have a bigger story than this in my whole lifetime, so I want to get busy and be the best I can on this story.
As we approach the 50th anniversary of the assassination, conspiracy theories still abound. Your thoughts?
Well, I don't have any argument with anyone about the Kennedy assassination. It's been 50 years, been a long time. In some ways, and sometimes I think, gosh, it's been 500 years. It's been so, and a lot of things have changed. But as one who has run investigations into the Kennedy assassination since the assassination, independent news investigations, trying to disprove the Warren Commission's conclusions, and being unable to do so, and indeed strengthening those conclusions. The Warren Commission, its process was flawed, was not perfect. Neither the CIA nor the FBI gave the Warren Commission everything the commission should have had. However, I don't want to leave any misconception that I believe that Lee Harvey Oswald was the shooter. I think he was the only shooter. And I've never seen any conclusive evidence, anything that persuaded me that anybody else was actively involved with him at the time. I do agree that there's more room for doubt, if you want to doubt, more room for doubt as to whether somebody helped him than there is. I think it's beyond reasonable doubt. One gun, one shooter. Oswald was the shooter. About that, I don't think there's any reasonable doubt. I understand there are people who think there's plenty of doubt about it. I'm not one of those people. In the area, was he connected with someone? Did someone help him? A conspiracy, after all, is anything more than one person. It's a conspiracy. There are a lot of questions about it, but again, it's been 50 years. Conspiracies are very hard to keep. Generally speaking, with a conspiracy, somebody eventually says something to their wife or girlfriend, talks to a priest or talks to their brother. It's been 50 years. But I'm open-minded about it. If somebody comes forward with evidence strongly indicating that somebody else was involved with him, I always listen and always consider it. But that's where I come out.
You've interviewed so many U.S. presidents. Which one did you admire most?
I admired them all, and that includes Richard Nixon. In a way, Richard Nixon, his presidency was a tragedy. He came to the presidency as well prepared as anyone. You know, I have tremendous respect for the office of the presidency. And looking back over the length and breadth of my career, and I've been very lucky to have interviewed every president since Harry Truman, there was something to admire in each of them. The Nixon presidency was the worst because he did lead a widespread criminal conspiracy, which we call for shorthand Watergate. But I'm not able to pick one. I do think that President Eisenhower's presidency has been underestimated for most of my lifetime. It has been something of a revival now. Two-term president who ended the war in Korea, led the nation to peace and, for the most part, prosperity. But I think the Eisenhower administration is perhaps the most underestimated of the presidencies since I've been covering presidents. We haven't had a dumb president.
Amazing. I mean, really.
Well, we're really lucky. Now, I'm talking in my time in covering presidents, which is getting to be a fairly long time now, we've not had a really dumb president. I know there's some people who point to this one and that one, but not in my experience. We haven't had a dumb president. And we've never had a truly evil president. Noted that President Nixon didn't. It was a disappointment because he didn't meet his constitutional responsibilities. But we haven't had a really dumb president. We haven't had a really evil president, which there are not all that many societies who can say that.
Mr. Rather, Dan, we just have a few seconds left here. What do you think is your greatest gift as a journalist?
I'm pausing because, one, I'm not much of a believer in gifts. You're a very good writer, but you've earned that. It's not something that was given to you, in my opinion. If I have a strength as a reporter, and I'm not sure that I do, it is that I get up early, I stay late, I try to work hard and smart in between, and I do love it. I have a great passion for journalism. But I also have a lot of flaws and weaknesses, most of which are very evident by this time.
Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you
with
very
us
much.
today.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
And thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.